Welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be going back to basics. We're going to be covering exhaustively everything you need to know about how to dry brush a high quality miniature as fast as possible. This tutorial is geared towards anyone, beginners, intermediates, advanced. There is going to be something here for everyone to learn. So if you are a returning dry brusher, if you've never dry brushed before, I'm going to take you through absolutely everything you need to know. Now I'm painting a piece of terrain. Dry brushing isn't for terrain. I think a lot of people, there's a misconception about that, but it is a great way to kind of loosen up, not care as much, and not be as precious about the final result that you achieve. Dry brushing is very procedural and it's actually incredibly forgiving. So if you are a process-based person, you really like knowing the rules and what and why, we've literally got some kind of numbered steps in the middle of the video to help you understand how to go about it, why your mistakes may be happening, that type of stuff. If you're more artistic and loose, then you've still got something there that you can refer to if kind of things go wrong and you don't know quite why it happened. It's a lovely technique. I'm obviously completely biased, but I think it's amazing. It's super powerful and it's capable of doing really, really advanced stuff. Even with a big old brush, I used an extra large brush to do all of that. Huge brush, and we got edge highlights out of it. We got precision painting. It looks absolutely amazing. So there's timestamps in the video. Please do use them. Skip through to whichever bit is the most relevant for you. Put them in there for your convenience. And if you do have any questions or whatever, then by all means, pop them below. Give it a like, comment, subscribe, hit that bell notification, you know the jam. Right, let's jump in. Okay, so this is a set of our dry brushes. That is a texture palette, which is optional. We can do them in different designs. This is the fundamental dry brush set. So the first thing that you're probably going to notice is, in comparison to a kind of a conventional dry brush, ours are round. Now that makes a big difference because it means that you can come at your model from any direction. We've also got a little pot of cleaner in here and a dampening pad, which is to add moisture to your paint throughout the process. This is how a texture palette comes brand new. I tend to abuse mine quite a lot, so let's hop over to that and some heavily used and abused brushes, and I will show you how to go about beginning to learn to dry brush. Now you can see this is worn down, but it's not worn outwards, it's not curled. That's another characteristic of not using a flat brush. These are kind of light bulb shaped and they tend to wear in rather than splaying out because they've got a lot of hairs in them to support them. So large is probably my most frequently used size. If I can get away with using an extra large, I absolutely will. One thing to bear in mind with dry brushing is I always say that it is best to use the largest possible brush for the job until the point where you can't get access to smaller areas. So the only reason I ever step down in dry brush is for precision. It's not for quality. I think a big dry brush will give you a lovely, more global, softer blend with dry brushing. This texture palette has obviously had a lot of abuse. It's how I tend to work. I put my paints here and I test them, and then I know exactly how my dry brushing is going to appear on my model because I've tested it on my texture palette. So let's start with something nice and forgiving. So I've got this massive, great big lump of Star Wars here. I'm going to prime this with black, and then I'm going to show you how I would go about painting this efficiently using basic dry brushing. The first massively underused aspect of dry brushing, in my opinion, is that you can stipple base coat models incredibly fast. This is a brilliant way to base coat models all over in one color. You can fade it if you want, but it's just a fantastic option for people who maybe don't have an airbrush accessible or another like speedy base coating method. So what I'm going to do is I've used my dampening pad. I just put one drop of water in there from the back of my brush. I'm going to use my dry brush in a pokey method. So I'm stippling here. I'm not wiping it, which is how traditional dry brushing works. I'm stippling all over this, and one of the massive benefits of this is because you're not wiping, you're not going to leave huge drifts of wet paint in any recesses on your model, and that actually is what can lead to either a bad base coat or indeed a base coat that just takes forever to dry. So this is both efficient, high quality, and a really good way to do it if you don't have an airbrush. If you want to fade between different colors, so for example, if I wanted to have the lighter sections of my base coat fade towards scrag brown, then because you're stippling, you're not putting down something opaque anyway. So actually it's an extremely flexible technique and essentially is a really, really good switch out in a number of aspects for airbrushing or for kind of fading transitional techniques like that. So very easily there without any effort. I've transitioned between two very different colors. So I'm going to base coat the entirety of the model, at least the sand, in these brown colors, and then I'm going to move on to the rocks. We've done our base coat with the Doom Ball brown. I've gone back to the dampening pad here. This is just to allow me to do a little bit of incidental washing on my brush. It's helping remove any excess brown that we've got there. I do this all the way throughout my painting because rather than adding more paint to my brush, I'd rather help the paint that's on there leave more easily and get down onto the model. So, rock time, we're going to be base coating with a little bit of dark Reaper. Now, even though I'm taking the paint directly from the pot, I'm not scooping it into the bristles. I take it with the end of the bristles and then I wipe it off, and I don't wipe it towards the brush, if that makes sense. So I'm never looking to oversaturate my brush. I just want the paint in the top end of the bristles, and equally if I don't tend to make it wet when it's got paint in it because I don't want paint running down into the ferrule, because that is a perfect way to shorten the life expectancy of any brush. It doesn't have to be a dry brush, that's just any type of brush available. So in exactly the same way as I did the base coat for the earth, I'm going to do the base coat for the rocks. Picked a nice dark grey here. It's got a hint of blue in it, which I think should look nice next to the warm browns we've got. So in exactly the same way that I did the earth, I'm going to do the rocks, and rather than going back and adding more paint, probably every 2 or 3 times, rather than going back when I feel I'd like more paint, I'll go back to my dampening pad, use that to reawaken what I've got on the brush, and then there we're helping the cleaning process for later, and that helps look after your brush too. So I just want to show you, given that I'm going to transition properly between colours now, I'm going to show you how I go about cleaning my brush. Now I do have brush cleaner in the set, but between colours, it's just a matter of removing excess that you have off your brush. I test in a lighter area because obviously you're going to be able to see more accurately how much paint is still left to leave your brush. And then once I've got it to a level that I'm happy with, I rotate it all the time to hit it from all angles. Then that brush has lost most of its excess of that colour, so the next colour isn't going to be contaminated. Now, of course, we can do a proper clean at the end of this, but for now, between colours, especially for terrain, that's absolutely fine, that's all you need. Okay, so I'm going to jump up to a brighter colour now for the rocks, and it's up to you. It depends how you feel about colour mixing. I often use a 50-50 between 2 colours. Now, generally speaking, I think it's good practice to put your paint on the palette, not to scoop it onto your brushes from the pot, so I use a tired old brush to do that. This brush has definitely seen better days. And I've got my 2 colours there on my palette, and then what I'll do is this working space allows me to drag as much of one into the other as I like, and then however I think the right ratio is, I can act accordingly to that. So let's put 1 more drop of water in the dampening pad. This is to make sure that even though it's called dry brushing, we don't want a nasty dry brush. That's what leads to clagging, and kind of a lot of the bad rep that dry brushing has, I think, stems from that. Also, I don't believe in removing moisture on a towel. I think that's the opposite of what you want to be doing. You want to keep moisture in the painting process, just have a very small controlled amount of paint. So I'm going to take our previous colour, drag it here at 45 degrees from the very end where it's the most shallow. I'm not saturating that brush at all. And then I'm going to take the new colour and drag it into that, and basically I'm going to mush them around while I keep rotating it until I think we're on about the right amount. Now at this point, very importantly, rather than going to the model, I'm going to go to my texture palette where I can test it out because it does have texture on it, remove a little bit, and then I'll get an idea of how it's going to behave on the model at that point. So just to go through that again quickly, that's about how much I want leaving. So at this point, that means we can now go to these rocks, and these rocks are instantly going to be picked out on a texture basis. You can use it in a circular motion because the brush is around. You don't have to be going from any one particular direction. I let the model dictate the direction I'm going from generally. So if I was doing this leg and I want to hit the edges, I go like that. And if I wanted to hit the top, I'd go like that. You're always going against the edge, but with them being rocks, Circular is absolutely fine, so that's the method that I'm going to use here, unless it's kind of an issue of angles. So I'll buff up all of these rocks beautifully. We'll get lovely, soft, organic looking highlights on them, and I'll do that all over the model. I'm really pleased with that, so I'm going to step up to a lighter colour. I've got Drybrushing grey here. So we're keeping in the grey spectrum, but it's still the blue-grey spectrum, and that should look really nice against the warm, browny, ready earth that we've got. Now, one thing to note here, any observant people among you probably already noticed, I've hit my ground. Don't worry about that. As we mentioned in the intro, it's all about processing and doing your stuff in the right order. I'm using a huge brush here. I'm using an extra large. That's really efficient. It's going to give me a really high quality result, but it will result in some overspill. So that's why we did the ground first, and we're going to do all but the last step or couple of steps of the rocks next. And the reasons will become evident soon. I'm going to take a tiny bit of my previous color into this color, again, just mixing that from the ends of the color on the palette. You can use neat colors if you prefer, if you don't like the idea of mixing. That can be a good idea if you're looking to be able to replicate it. It's just down to personal preference. So with this brighter color instantly, we're going to find that we have to put in less effort. You'll see that I'm holding my brush pretty loosely. I'm holding it basically on the crimps, on the ferrule, all the way back. If you hold it here, it's rigid. If you hold it here, it's more flexible. And what that's allowing me to do is just lightly highlight. Now, I always brace my miniature very carefully for dry brushing. If you've got it held somewhere wobbly, not having a rigid base to be targeting really affects the quality of your dry brushing. So it'll be braced here, braced in my hand. You'll notice that a lot if you've seen any of my other videos. I'm always very conscious of holding it secure. You can go in whatever direction you want, and yeah, we'll go all over this. This stage your stages will get faster and faster as you go on, as you've got a higher proportion of really light, high contrasting colors in your mix. You have to do less and less to get a really nice kind of obvious, realistic highlight to your base. Now, as a quick step, I've got some black on my palette. I'm using a medium here. What I'm going to do is remove the excess, and I'm just quickly, this is very, very optional, but I like the artwork that I've seen for this terrain piece, and I'm trying to emulate it. I'm just going to make the terrain piece a little bit darker towards the bottom, and I'm also, while I'm here, going to use this to put a slight transition between the rocks and the sand. Now, it doesn't need to be delicate at all, just a visual effect, and then particularly with it being such a flat piece, for dry brushing the bottom, I can just go left to right around it in an extremely efficient manner. That little darkening effect around the bottoms looked really lovely, I think. I've got here Scrag Brown, which is the highlight to our base of the Doom Ball Brown. And as you can see, my brush, even though it's taken on some color from the gray, it's not saturated or anything like that, so we can move straight on to this. Exactly the same method as we used for the rocks. I'm using the big brush. I am going to take more care with this than I did with the rocks because I have to, basically. I think we can go with the pure Scrag Brown actually, no need to mix. So this is going to be buffed everywhere. Obviously, if you're not next to anything that you could contaminate, so the black bits haven't been painted yet, I don't need to worry about those. You don't need to worry about being delicate, but I will slow down and be a little bit more careful and directional when I get too close to the rocks. It doesn't matter if you get a little bit of overspill. It's an organic landscape, of course, and this is one of the reasons why terrain is such a forgiving and good idea to start on when practicing your dry brushing. Terrain and tanks, I think, are probably, or very, very organic models like aliens or Tyranids or demons or something like that. Terrain is a fantastic recipient, so I'm going to hit it with the Scrag Brown all over. That's looking fantastic. I have Deathclaw Brown here, and just in the same way as the previous step, I've got the previous color, which is our Scrag Brown, there available if needed. So I'm going to take some, put it very lightly on my brush. I've used a dampening pad, so it's going to be soft whatever I do. Remove excess, probably remove too much excess, test it somewhere. Now we're good. So we can go in with our neat Deathclaw now without worrying too much about it being too over the top. As I mentioned with the rocks, this is about the point, because the colors got so much lighter than our original. You can see the difference there on the palette. I'm going to be holding the brush softly now. Now this does mean that you can get away with removing less from the brush, but you do need to be mindful of streaking. So it's up to you. You can get exactly the same result by being very soft with more paint, or by removing more paint and kind of painting with the same amount of physical pressure as you were previously. It's just down to personal preference. The bonus of going softer with more paint is you only have to do one stroke, so you're less likely to get overspill on the rocks like I am here. And the bonus with the other one is you can't really get any streaking anywhere, so you're less likely to get a big blob. I'm painting something hyper textured, so the chance of getting blobs on this really aggressively textured resin sand terrain is very unlikely, but I'm still going to be mindful, especially when I'm doing the first paint strokes. It's always the first time you go to the model that you're the most likely to make a mistake. You can see I almost got some streaking there, and that's just because I've not removed a lot of the excess yet. So with that done, we're pretty much through to the final highlight stages on both aspects of our terrain. And broadly speaking, the reason I've done it in this order is to make sure that there's some organic kind of overspill from the ground onto the rocks, but then I get to fix it with the final stage of painting the rocks and the final stage of painting the earth. So it's all going to come together very shortly. Now at this stage, I'm going to quickly go around and I'm going to base coat all of the terrain sections. Now, part of the reason for choosing a blue grey for the rocks is because I wanted to have a neutral grey available for the parts of machinery. So I'm going to scoot round and really quickly give all of those a base coat. You can do this however you like. So if you've got an airbrush, you could airbrush them. If you want to stipple them, you could stipple them, especially these larger sections, or you could do a combination of both, which is probably what I'm going to end up doing. Either way, this allows you to kind of neatly section off all of these parts, and depending how embedded within your environment you want these to be, like whether it's just crashed there now or if it's been there for, I mean, years, centuries, however you want to see it, that will dictate at what point you do this. So if I'd done this a lot sooner and then I'd done all of my dry brushing stages, these would be covered in those browns and they'd look very organic, very kind of embedded in their environment. I want this to look like it's a somewhat recent addition, and that's why I'm doing it at this point. Okay, so on my palette I have our previous layer, which is Deathclaw Brown, and I've just got a bone color, it doesn't matter which, I've got Screaming Skull. So we're going to be doing the final highlight for our ground first, and the reason for that is I want the rocks to have this in the recesses, not on the raised areas if we do make any mistakes. So as ever, working off the excess, and like I said, we can really get away with a very, very light touch for this now, and perhaps you just want this on only the very, very raised areas. So it's up to you how gentle or rough you want to be. I'll hit up all the brown with this and then we'll move on to the grey. So I'm pulling a little bit of Ulthuan grey here. You could use a white and mix it with your previous colour if you don't have an Ulthuan grey available. I'm showing you the kind of the principles behind it, but as I said, it's super procedural. So you could take these out, you could swap these for pinks if you wanted, it really wouldn't matter. It's just the same type of method. And you just change the colours that you're using to suit whatever it is that's your subject. That looks absolutely fantastic. Loads of variety in there, loads and loads and loads of texture, and it was fun and pretty fast as well. So I kept a timer off screen, 40 minutes for that, and working under the camera I find it far slower. So you could remove as many stages of that as you liked and just still end up with an amazingly solid job. It's up to you just to pick how long you've got and what you want to achieve in that time. And dry brushing is a fantastic technique because you can just remove the stages between other things, and because it's texture based, you're still going to get a load of variety in shades there, even out of one color, because more of it will land on the raised areas and less or none of it will land in the recesses, and the middle amount will kind of land in the middle of those two. So it's a really good way to efficiently do anything, and it's up to you if you want to have more graduations in colour in between different stages. Alright, so you've seen me painting, now let's run through the exact principles that I've used within that. Now, all of these are principles that are going to affect how the amount of paint you have on your brush leaves your brush and how that affects the final model. Number one, in its own section, because it is so important, is the amount of paint. You've seen how much I remove paint on the texture palette, how much I test it on the texture palette, how much I text it on the back of my hand. All of that is so that when I go to the model, I know exactly how much paint it's going to leave. Number two, it's the pressure I use. I've already spoke about where I hold the brush, if I hold it right at the end or close to the ferrule, if I loose grip it, if I firm grip it. The amount of pressure that you put on your brush, how firm it is obviously going to affect how much of the paint is forced off the brush onto your model. The colour, so the colour of your paint. You'll have noticed throughout that, as I get to the final colours, the brighter colours, the lighter colours, towards white, bone, etc., they really, really stand out, and it almost doesn't matter how much pressure I use, how much I've got on the brush, whatever I do is going to stand out. And that's just by merit of contrast. That works the other way too. So if you're putting down some, I don't know, soot stains with black on top of a light grey, just like the model we've done, then, you know, it doesn't take much for black to stand out on light grey. Moisture. So how much you have used your dampening pad, how wet your paint is. Some paints just come out wetter than others, some paints come out thicker, and that will affect how easy they leave your brush. Now, we've already done it, and I just want to completely iron out how the technique that we've used has resulted in our model being painted. Let's imagine this is the varied textures of our model. This is also our first deep brown base coat. The first layer of dry brushing we did after our foundation base paint, that covered, let's say, the top 3/4 of all of these. The second layer, the lighted layer, that covered the top 50%. The penultimate layer before the final highlight, that covered the top quarter, and then the very final super light stage, that just caught the tips of the bits that stuck out the most. Now it's up to you. You can make sure that each area gets all of these stages and the tip, or you can just do it like that. It's up to you, really. It's just about what you want to control on the model you've got, the environment you want, and the final effect that you want your model to give. But all of these combine with that. Obviously the texture of the model is really important. I had a very aggressively textured sand model, which is just asking to pull paint off the brush. If it's a smooth area, then you might have to stipple more or push it more into to get it to leave, and we'll come to that in the next stage. So there is exactly how it worked on the model we've got, and these are the principles that you can follow to kind of see how much paint is leaving your brush. If too much is leaving your brush, it's going to be either this one or it's going to be this one, generally speaking. You know how hard you're pressing, and the color, you know what color you've picked, but these are the two that will really affect. If you've got big splodges or stains, then it's probably down to one of those two being too much paint, too much moisture. Okay, so I'm about to cover what I would regard as kind of intermediate level dry brushing, although you can achieve a very advanced level paint job. And I'm going to be using stippling, just like we used in the base coating of the base, but we're going to be using this for a smooth, beautiful, hopefully pretty much flawless transition that we're then going to muck up with some weathering and battle damage. So I've got here the same Esching grey that we've used to base coat the model elsewhere, then a black and a white, and I'm going to use exactly the same beginner principles that we used in the first video, but I'm going to use them in an advanced fashion. So we're going to go from dark up to light. You could go light to dark, you know, whichever way is fine, and it's an organic technique, so you can go one way then the other. So I'm going to begin by taking some of my black. Again, I'm not saturating my brush at all. I'm carefully dragging my paints in until I've got exactly as much as I need. I have a very, very dark grey, and what I'm going to do is pretty much hit all of the model with this, but I'm stippling, and if I leave anywhere, I'm going to choose to have my light coming from this direction, because the model's like this. So this top section, they're going to be where the light hits and it's brighter, and the bottom sections are going to be where it's darker. So I'm going to stipple this on, making sure not to miss anywhere. It may be barely perceptible, that's a mouthful and a tongue twister, but it's absolutely worth taking your time and doing correctly. So I'm going to do all of this, and I'm hitting it with a stipple. It's very important to have this base coat, otherwise the preceding greys will seem very, very strange. So it's worth taking a couple of minutes to do, even if you can barely tell the difference afterwards. So stipple this pretty much all over. If you're going to leave anywhere, leave very, very shadowed corners. We're just going to go in with our neat Esching grey. Again, we're taking it from the edge of the paint really carefully. And again, we're going to start at whatever edge we want to be the brightest. So our bright point is coming here and going outwards, but all the top of this bit's going to be fairly bright. So I go in there. Physically, my pressure is pretty heavy at this point. And then what we do as the paint runs out itself, we reduce the pressure. And I'm also going to begin to dry brush here. So we are stippling and we're dry brushing at the same time. The reason for that is we're going for directional effect, and I want the top lips, as far as our miniature is concerned, to be hit with more paint. And that is going to help simulate natural light, basically. So next step, we're going to be starting to introduce some white. You could use, instead of mixing black, dark grey, mid grey, light grey, lightest grey, white, but I'm going to go from these, entirely up to you. And of course, as I've touched on with the other colours, you could absolutely mix it up colour-wise. Now that white is a particularly strong one, so hopefully I've not gone too full on here. I'm going to remove quite a lot, work it in. This is just going to help work it into the bristles, which will homogenise it with the previous colour. And then as ever, we're going to start from top right. And we're not going to take this all the way down. If you go too heavy, you can always nip in there with a finger. And then once we're happy with the stippling and we've got the right amount of paint on the brush, which isn't quite yet, we can go on to the dry brushing, which is directional. And basically we're going to be doing this just in an ever increasing area and with lighter colours as we go on with each step. So remember, if you want to make sure things stay super smooth, you've got your dampening pad at your disposal. And the way to use that is before going to your paint, you can work off the excess with it, but you can also use it if you've got too much paint on your brush, or sorry, if you know there's paint on your brush but it's not leaving, you can then go to your dampening pad and use it to take off excess. Of course, because you're adding water to the process, it will also dilute, which is a really good way to kind of soften the effect of anything that you're doing within painting ever. And I think people just aren't aware that you can use the same principles in dry brushing that you can do in normal painting. So at this point, we can really start pulling some white into our mix. I'm using a particularly strong white here. Most whites aren't very strong, so if you need to use a higher proportion of white than you would expect, then that's probably why, particularly with a grey. Some greys are powerful, most greys are powerful, some greys are weak, but that's a little bit more rare. So I'm going to use my dampening pad here. I'm really looking to only kind of lightly tint and hint at this lighter grey from the top corners. So I've wiped off the excess, and really carefully we're going to introduce it to the model. Now, you're much better to wipe off too much rather than too little. That's what I get for trying to multitask, isn't it? But hopefully, as you can see there, if you get the right amount on the brush, not only is it almost possible to make a mistake, but you get these lovely, lovely soft blends. We've introduced the moisture from the dampening pad, and we can carry on going kind of directionally with these. If you want to highlight bottom edges, then I use a rolling motion. So to really, really exaggerate it, you're taking your brush and you're doing this. You're not just doing that, you're doing that. And what that will do is it'll really selectively, even with a huge fatty like the extra large, it will specifically hit specific edges. And you can do that to even highlight inside edges like that window there if you wish. So do that, and then if we wanted to do more overall shading, then we could do that carefully with the stippling. Now obviously we've got a battle-worn mottled vehicle here, so if you wanted to be super smooth, you could use the dampening pad even more, use more stages, but I'm doing something pretty rough and ready that's going to look like it's led a pretty hard life, so that's the reason for going about it in that fashion. As a final stage, we can add a little bit more white. Now because I've already got paint in the brush at this point, I can just work it in, make sure you test it somewhere, and use it like that. And that is how we get super smooth blends, really fast edge highlights, and also a realistic kind of weather beaten patina in one go. Or use the same brush, start to finish. We'll do that all over the model. It'll look amazing. Okay, so I'm actually going to ramp up the contrast a little more, I think. Take some of the white in there, work a lot of it off, and then we're going to proceed with care here. So fingers to the back of the ferrule. That will help you control your pressure. And then I'm hitting this directionally. So from the direction that I imagine it's being lit from. And if I want, I can choose to pick out edges with a rolling technique. So this is everything you need to paint super flawless, organic, soft blends, transitional fades, anything like that. All of the techniques are the same. And that's really striking. If we go to the back here, particularly where we've got a lot of detail, take a tiny amount of white, work it in from every direction. Test it on my thumb first. I'm cool with that, and then really carefully hit it all from that direction that we've been talking about. Only when we've removed a lot am I happy to go in there and gently buff the top sections of these details, and that'll give the indication that they're being lit from above. Look at that, absolutely fantastic. No edge highlight in traditional brushing in sight. We've got all of that with just the dry brush, and it's an extra large as well. Doesn't feel like detail. For those of you that are fans of high contrast, which I absolutely am, this is what you can do with a final white dry brush. I'm not going to hit opposition edges like this, I'm just going to hit top edges, and that should really drive home our light source. Look at that though. Looks absolutely amazing. 3 colors, 20 minutes, and if you're not doing it whilst trying to teach a camera, it's way easier, way more forgiving, and you can actually get a smoother result if you take a little bit more time over it as well. So it can be used for anything from beginner to elite painting, as long as you know what your objective is and you follow the right procedures. Looks fantastic, absolutely amazing, really enjoyable, really fast. Quite a lot of you will probably have some questions about the dampening pad, exactly how much water. I have some steps for that as well. You put in 1 drop of water from the back of your brush. So you take your brush, put it in your water pot, put 1 drop in, work it in. You work that in with 1 finger, then you take a clean, dry finger, press that in, have a look at that finger. If there is a light sheen, just a sheen of moisture, that is the right amount. If there are droplets, that is too much. I still, when I will take my brush to the dampening pad, I will test it on the back of my hand, work off any excess, and that's when I take it to the model. You will reap the benefits of that. Miniature paints are made to have water added to them. They're made to be diluted. You know all the cliches, 2 thin coats, dilute your paint, all of that jazz. We're not using dry paints here, we're just using normal paints. So there's no reason not to apply exactly those same beneficial principles from layering to dry brushing, and that's what we've done here. So the final result speaks for itself, I think. If you have any questions at all about the overall methods, the theory, how I would go about weathering that with kind of like soot stains or damage or anything like that, if you'd like to see me finish it or tuft it, I do like tufting, or anything like that, then let me know. We will take all comments, suggestions and criticisms on board. We're here to help, here to kind of dispel rumors, get more people into the magic of dry brushing. I'm pretty biased, but I think it's great. And yeah, so please give the video a like, a comment and subscribe. Hit that bell notification to be notified for our future content, and we will catch you in the next video.